In a small southern town, Jamal Carter, a successful black CEO, faces intense racial prejudice and systemic corruption as he fights for a development project that promises to bring economic growth to Millbrooke, targeted by corrupt local officials, including the racist Officer Daniels and the town's powerful elites. Jamal becomes the focus of false accusations and intimidation. Despite being constantly undermined due to his race, Jamal refuses to back down, confronting the deeply ingrained biases and power structures that seek to silence him and prevent change. His struggle exposes the town's ugly truths and forces a reckoning with its corrupt system. Jamal Carter had always been a man of routine. His days followed a rhythm, precise, almost meditative. He was used to the hustle of running a multi-million-dollar company, a tech firm that was reshaping the industry. But when he wasn't in meetings, signing contracts, or overseeing his empire, he sought simplicity. This, however, was a luxury most people couldn't afford. Today, Jamal was in his favorite place, a small, nondescript diner on the outskirts of Millbrooke, a sleepy town nestled in the heart of Georgia. He could have had breakfast in any lavish restaurant in the city, but he preferred the anonymity this little diner provided. No one here knew him as the CEO of Carter Tech, the firm that had become one of the most successful in the country. Here, he was just another man sitting at the counter, sipping his coffee. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a soft southern drawl, brought his usual: scrambled eggs, toast, and a side of bacon. She smiled warmly, though her gaze lingered just a moment too long, as if trying to place him. She didn't ask questions though, and Jamal appreciated that he was used to the curious glances from people who couldn't quite put their finger on who he was, but still felt compelled to stare. As he picked up his mug, the familiar scent of strong coffee filling the air, Jamal leaned back in his seat, watching the small town bustle outside the diner's window. The town was quiet, the kind of place where nothing happened unless it was tied to the old courthouse or the church down the street. Jamal had grown up here, but he hadn't set foot in the courthouse since he'd left for college. That building, with its aged bricks and cracked steps, was a symbol of everything he had tried to escape. A symbol of stagnation and the generations of people who had felt invisible in its shadow. But now, as an adult, he could see the cracks in the system that ran this town. Cracks that were as deep and ingrained as the ones in the courthouse. Millbrooke wasn't exactly progressive. In fact, in some ways, it still felt stuck in the past. Racism, though perhaps less overt, still lingered in the air, thin but palpable. And Jamal, despite his success, could never fully escape that. "Anything else for you, hon?" the waitress asked, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. "No, ma'am," Jamal replied, with a small smile, his voice warm and polite. He had mastered the art of politeness over the years, something necessary when you were a black man with a profile that made people uncomfortable. There were certain spaces he simply didn't belong in, but he'd learned to navigate them with grace. As the waitress walked away, Jamal's eyes drifted to the small television mounted in the corner of the diner. It was playing a news segment about a protest in a nearby city, highlighting the growing divide between communities and law enforcement. He couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. The issues facing people like him weren't just confined to big cities or tech companies. They were everywhere, even here in Millbrooke. The protest was a stark reminder that no matter how successful he became, the fight for equality was ongoing. The door to the diner opened, and the bell above it chimed softly. A man in his mid-40s, dressed in a crisp suit, stepped in. His eyes scanned the room before landing on Jamal. The man hesitated, then made a beeline for the counter. "Jamal Carter?" The man's voice was sharp, and his tone betrayed a hint of surprise. "I thought that was you." Jamal didn't immediately respond. He wasn't sure whether the man was genuinely surprised to see him, or just another one of those people who felt the need to comment on his success. He turned to face the man, his posture relaxed but alert. "Yes, I'm Jamal," he said, his voice measured but friendly. "How can I help you?" The man sat down beside him without asking, a move that was a little too familiar for Jamal's taste. He could tell this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Didn't realize someone like you would come to a place like this," the man said, nodding toward the worn-down diner. His words weren't rude, but there was a certain condescension in his tone. "I figured someone with your profile would be too busy for small-town places like this. Jamal kept his expression neutral, resisting the urge to bristle. He'd heard variations of this comment countless times before. People who felt the need to point out that he was too successful for certain spaces. It was a strange kind of judgment, the kind that implied a black man, no matter how much he achieved, should always be seen as an outsider in some circles. "I'm here because I like it," Jamal said calmly, taking another sip of his coffee. "Sometimes the simplicity is a welcome change." The man raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Instead, he smiled in a way that was too knowing, like he was trying to figure out what game Jamal was playing. "I see," he said, his voice laced with something Jamal couldn't quite place. "Well, I'm Andrew Harper, by the way I work over at the courthouse." He paused, letting the title hang in the air, as if waiting for it to have some sort of weight. "Nice to meet you, Andrew," Jamal replied with a small, polite nod. He knew what this was. Andrew was one of the many men in this town who felt they had the right to question his place in the world, even if he didn't say it outright. The courthouse was the seat of power in Millbrooke, and people like Andrew had spent their lives there, ensuring things stayed as they were. "I've heard of you," Andrew continued, his tone shifting to something more conspiratorial. "Carter Tech, right impressive company, I'll give you that. But you know, I've always wondered what a man like you is really doing in a town like this. I mean, you've got everything. The big house, the fancy car, the wealth. What brings you back here?" Jamal felt the weight of the question, but he didn't let it show. He had learned long ago not to let people see the inner workings of his thoughts. He smiled, leaning back slightly in his seat. "I grew up here," he said simply. "Sometimes it's good to come home, even if it's just for a short while." Andrew leaned in, his voice lowering just enough that only Jamal could hear. "Funny, isn't it?" he said, almost as though the words were rehearsed. "How someone like you can rise to such heights, yet still come back here like everyone else. Like you're one of us. But the thing is, Jamal, you'll never really be one of us. No matter how much money you make, no matter how many companies you own, you're still just another black man in a town that doesn't always welcome people like you." Jamal's heart skipped a beat, but his expression remained unchanged. It was clear now that this wasn't just a casual conversation. Andrew wasn't asking about his business, he was making a point, a dangerous one. "I think you're mistaken," Jamal replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm exactly where I want to be." For a long moment, Andrew didn't speak. He just stared at Jamal, as if waiting for something, some crack in his composure. But Jamal held his ground. He had faced far worse than this. As Andrew stood and turned to leave, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Jamal to hear, "You'll see sooner or later, they'll remind you of who you really are." Jamal watched him go, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft chime. The waitress returned to refill his coffee, her eyes flicking to the door where Andrew had just left. She offered Jamal a small, apologetic smile, as if she knew exactly what had just transpired. "You all right, hun?" she asked quietly. Jamal nodded, though inside, his mind was racing. He wasn't just facing the challenges of running a billion-dollar company, he was facing something far more dangerous, something systemic, something that would take more than wealth and success to overcome. Millbrooke might have been his home, but it had never truly accepted him, not completely. As he stood up to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The next few days in Millbrooke were a blur of quiet tension. Jamal had spent the morning at the local courthouse, meeting with the town's mayor about a new development project his company was spearheading. He had already begun laying the groundwork for expansion, and the mayor had been receptive at first. But the deeper they got into the discussion, the more Jamal felt the unease settle around him, like a thick fog. The meeting had gone smoothly enough at the start. The mayor, a man in his early 60s with an air of confidence, had greeted him with a firm handshake and a practiced smile. Jamal had come prepared, bringing everything from blueprints to projected timelines, trying to stay focused on the task at hand. But something about the mayor's smile never quite reached his eyes. There was an odd politeness to the way he spoke to Jamal, the kind of politeness that felt hollow. "I've heard a lot of good things about your company, Jamal," the mayor said, his voice smooth, but tinged with a certain wariness. "You've done well for yourself, Can't deny that I'm just wondering how the people of Millbrooke will feel about this project this big. It's going to change the landscape of the town. I'm not here to change the town's character, just to help improve it, Jamal replied, his tone steady and measured. The new development will create jobs, bring in revenue, and give people opportunities to stay here rather than leave for bigger cities. It's a win-win. The mayor nodded, though his eyes seemed distant, calculating Jamal could almost hear the wheels turning in the man's head. I'm sure it's a great plan, but you know, some folks here might not be so enthusiastic about all these changes. You're talking about a lot of new people coming into the town. People who don't exactly fit the traditional mold. Jamal stiffened. He had heard these words before, in different forms, from different people. The thinly veiled reference to the newcomers, people like him, was unmistakable. He had no doubt the mayor was trying to tiptoe around the issue, but the implication was clear. Jamal wasn't welcome here in the same way others might be. I'm not here to replace anyone, Jamal said, forcing a smile. I'm here to invest in the future of this town, including its people. This town can grow and adapt while still keeping its roots. There's room for everyone. The mayor didn't respond immediately, instead choosing to tap a pencil against the wooden desk. The silence stretched out, thick with tension. It was the kind of silence that made Jamal's pulse quicken, the kind that said everything without saying a word. He knew that, deep down, the mayor was resistant, maybe even outright hostile, to the idea of Jamal's presence here. But it wasn't just about the project. It was about who Jamal was, a black man, successful beyond the town's expectations, whose mere existence challenged the status quo. I'll think about it, the mayor said finally, his voice curt. But you need to understand that change around here doesn't come easily. People don't take well to outsiders. It's going to be hard to sell this idea to the community. Jamal wanted to push back, wanted to challenge the mayor's assumptions, but he knew better than to escalate things. He had learned long ago that pushing against people's biases often led to more harm than good, especially in small towns like Millbrooke. So, instead of rising to the challenge, he simply nodded. He had dealt with worse. He could handle this. He wasn't here to make enemies, not when so much was at stake. Later that afternoon, Jamal walked into a local department store to pick up a few things. The store was busy, with a mixture of older locals and younger couples wandering the aisles. He knew that even something as mundane as shopping would have its challenges in Millbrooke, but Jamal was determined to carry on with his day as if nothing had changed. He walked down an aisle lined with clothing, reaching for a shirt on the top shelf when he noticed the store manager watching him from the end of the aisle. The man had been following him with a gaze that felt too focused, too intense. It was a glance that bordered on suspicion, the kind that could be chalked up to paranoia or simple prejudice. Jamal, trying not to let it bother him, continued his task, pulling a shirt off the rack and inspecting it. When he reached the counter to pay, the manager appeared at his side, his demeanor suddenly all politeness. "Good afternoon, sir," the man said, his tone overly formal. "I'll be happy to help you with your purchase." Jamal raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden shift. He had been in the store several times before and had never been treated this way. He nodded politely. "Thank you." The manager's hands were shaking as he scanned the items. Jamal could feel the tension in the air, the subtle discomfort that rippled through the store's atmosphere. As the transaction finished, the manager made a point to ask for ID, something Jamal knew wasn't necessary for a purchase of this size. He bit back the urge to question it, knowing it would lead to an uncomfortable confrontation. "I just need to verify the address," the manager said, his voice too steady, too rehearsed. Jamal handed over his driver's license, trying to suppress the frustration building in his chest. As the manager inspected it, his eyes flickered over the information with a hint of disbelief, then quickly returned to Jamal's face. "Everything seems in order," the manager muttered, handing back the ID and taking Jamal's payment. "Thank you," Jamal said, his voice cold now, despite his best efforts to remain calm. The exchange had been brief, but it was clear the manager had been scrutinizing him, uncomfortable with Jamal's presence, as if he didn't belong. As Jamal left the store, the weight of it all hit him. The looks, the microaggressions, the undertones of suspicion. It was exhausting, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. He couldn't afford to let anyone see just how much it hurt. Not when he had fought so hard to get where he was. The next day, Jamal decided to stop by the local coffee shop for a quick break before a meeting with his legal team. It was a small, family-run business, and despite the tension in the air, Jamal had always enjoyed the quiet comfort of a good cup of coffee. The barista, a young woman who had always been friendly, greeted him with a smile as he walked in, but the moment Jamal stepped up to the counter, the older man in line ahead of him, a regular in town, gave him a long, scrutinizing look. His eyes lingered too long on Jamal's face, sizing him up in a way that made Jamal uncomfortable. The man then turned to the barista and made a point of speaking louder than necessary. "You gotta be careful about who you serve around here," the man said, his words carrying through the quiet shop. "Can't let just anyone walk in off the street." The barista hesitated for a moment, glancing at Jamal, her face flushing with embarrassment. She stammered, "I'm sorry, sir. I'll be right with you." Jamal stayed quiet, taking in the situation. He could feel the heat of the man's words sting, but he didn't let it show. He had dealt with far worse before. But what made this particular moment sting the most was that the man was insinuating that Jamal didn't belong here, in this small shop, despite the fact that he had been a regular for years. When it was finally Jamal's turn, the barista took his order in a hurried manner, her gaze avoiding his. She handed him his coffee without a word, the tension between them palpable. Jamal paid, but as he walked out, the weight of the town's prejudice settled heavier on his shoulders. He was used to fighting for respect in the boardrooms and at industry events. But here, in his hometown, it felt like the real battle was just beginning. And no matter how successful he became, it seemed there was always someone who would remind him of his place. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, not just in Millbrooke, but with the entire system around him. His phone had been ringing off the hook, calls from his legal team, the mayor's office, and even a few industry contacts who had heard whispers about the development project. But it wasn't the pressure of running a business that gnawed at him. It was the palpable sense that the very air in Millbrooke had turned hostile. The morning after his unpleasant encounter at the coffee shop, Jamal arrived at his office early, hoping to bury himself in work to distract from the growing unease. The atmosphere in the town had shifted, and it wasn't just the subtle glances he was receiving now. People had become openly confrontational. Rumors about the development project were swirling, whispers of Jamal being too ambitious, too powerful, and not the right person to lead such a change. But he had built Carter Tech from the ground up. He'd fought for every inch of success, every contract, and every breakthrough. The people of Millbrooke may have underestimated him, but he knew better than to let it all slip away. He wasn't going to stop now. Around noon, a call came in from the local sheriff's department. The voice on the other end was stiff, unrecognizable. "Mr. Carter, we need you to come down to the station," the officer said, the words deliberate but vague. "There's a situation we need to discuss." Jamal felt his stomach drop. It wasn't the first time he'd been called in by the local authorities, but this felt different. Something about the officer's tone didn't sit right with him. He could hear the thin edge of suspicion, as though the call wasn't about an innocent inquiry, but something darker. "I'll be there in a few minutes," Jamal replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. The sheriff's department was located on the edge of town, a squat, gray building that looked as though it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. As Jamal stepped out of his car and approached the entrance, he was met with the usual stares, the same lingering looks of disbelief that followed him everywhere. He knew what they saw: someone who didn't belong, someone who had gotten too far ahead of the people who had always stayed behind. He was used to it, but it still stung. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of coffee and must. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s, with a look of perpetual disinterest, glanced up as Jamal entered, her eyes flicking over him with the same calculating gaze he'd grown so familiar with. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat. "I'm here to see Officer Daniels," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice even. He'd been hearing his name far too much lately, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Daniels was somehow behind all of this. "Take a seat," she said curtly. Nodding toward a row of plastic chairs against the wall, Jamal did as he was told, his eyes scanning the office. Nothing looked out of the ordinary, but he felt a weight on his chest. It wasn't just the building or the people, it was everything. The whole town felt like it was slowly closing in on him. Moments later, a door at the back of the office swung open, and out stepped Officer Daniels. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that was perpetually set in a scowl. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished, but the look in his eyes was something else, something colder, harder. As he approached Jamal, the slight twitch of his lips suggested there was no love lost between them. "You wanted to see me?" Daniels asked, his voice clipped. "I was told to come in," Jamal replied, standing up to meet him. "What's going on?" Daniels didn't answer immediately. Instead, he led Jamal down a hallway and into an interrogation room. Bright lights overhead, metal chairs, the sterile smell of cleaning supplies in the air. "You've been causing a lot of problems, Mr. Carter," Daniels said, his voice low, the tension in his words barely concealed. Jamal's eyes narrowed. "I've been causing problems. I'm trying to invest in this town. I'm bringing jobs, opportunities. If anyone's causing problems, it's people like you. People who don't want change." Daniels ignored him, instead, dropping a manila folder onto the table between them. He opened it slowly, as if savoring the moment. "We've had complaints," Daniels continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "about your project, and about you people around here don't like the idea of someone like you coming in, making all these promises. There's talk, Carter talk, that you're trying to force the town's hand, that you think you're above everyone." Jamal clenched his fists, his anger rising. "This isn't about me or my project, it's about who I am. You've got a problem with me being black and successful in a town like this, don't you?" Daniels didn't flinch. He just stared at Jamal, his eyes hardening. "I'm just here to make sure the law is followed," he said, though the words didn't sound convincing. "You're pushing people too far, and people aren't going to take kindly to being pushed." Jamal's pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the walls closing in on him. The room felt too small, the air too thick. He had dealt with prejudice in many forms, but this was different. This wasn't just passive aggression, this was systemic, and it was coming from the very people who were supposed to protect him. "I'm not going anywhere," Jamal said, his voice unwavering. "I'm doing this the right way. If anyone's breaking the law here, it's not me. It's people like you, trying to keep the town locked in the past." For a moment, Daniels didn't say anything. He just sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping the edge of the table. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Then, without warning, he stood up abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. "You'll regret that, Carter," Daniels said, his voice low and menacing. "People around here don't like being talked down to." Jamal stood, feeling the weight of the officer's threat like a physical blow, but he refused to show fear. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Just as Jamal turned to leave, the door to the office opened, and a younger officer stepped inside. The tension in the room thickened, and Jamal turned his gaze toward him. There was something different about this officer. Hesitation in his eyes, like he wasn't sure where his loyalty lay. "Everything all right, Daniels?" the younger officer asked, his voice unsure. Daniels turned sharply, his tone cold. "This doesn't concern you, Mitchell." But the younger officer, Mitchell, didn't back down. He glanced at Jamal, then back at Daniels, a flicker of something resembling doubt crossing his face. "Maybe it does," Mitchell said quietly. "Maybe it's time we start doing things the right way." The words hung in the air like a spark, dangerous and uncertain. Jamal could see the internal struggle playing out in Mitchell's eyes. But before anything could be said, Daniels shot a glare at Mitchell, one that told him to fall in line. "Enough," Daniels snapped. "Carter, you're free to go, but don't think for a second that this is over." Jamal nodded once, his jaw tight, and walked out of the room without another word. His mind was racing. The walls were closing in. Daniels had made it clear that the town's power structures were aligned against him, and the legal system was just another tool in their arsenal to keep him in his place. But Mitchell's words stayed with him. The realization hit Jamal hard. The real fight was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. The day after his tense encounter with Officer Daniels at the sheriff's department, Jamal had hoped things might calm down. He tried to focus on his work, hoping the brewing storm in Millbrooke would blow over. But deep down, he knew better. The whispers had only grown louder, and the threats more tangible. It started with a phone call from one of his contacts in the community, a local journalist named Tasha. She had been quietly investigating the corruption that had plagued Millbrooke for years. But her sources had dried up. When things started getting dangerous, Jamal had always admired her determination. But even she couldn't shield herself from the town's systemic biases. "Tasha," Jamal greeted her, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's going on?" "There's been an incident." Tasha's voice was tight, laced with fear. "And it's bigger than you think, Jamal. I'm at the courthouse right now. They're talking about moving against you. The project. They're trying to stop it by any means necessary." Jamal felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean, stop it? We've already got permits, approvals. What's happening?" "They're fabricating evidence," Tasha said, her words coming in rapid bursts. "A group of people in the mayor's office and some cops, they've been talking about planting something they can use to accuse you of illegal activities. They want to tie your company to money laundering, anything to discredit you." Jamal's mind raced, the words sinking in like a stone dropped into water. It wasn't just about the project anymore. It was about him, about his reputation, his legacy. They were coming for everything. "I've got people on the inside who are telling me things aren't looking good," Tasha continued. "You need to be careful. This is bigger than just local corruption. There are people who want you gone, Jamal. They'll stop at nothing." Jamal didn't respond immediately. His mind was already in overdrive, but the fear in Tasha's voice fueled his determination. He couldn't let this happen. Not now, not after everything he had built. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was here, and he had to be ready for it. By the time Jamal left his office, it was late in the afternoon, and the town of Millbrooke was bathed in an eerie golden light. As he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The streets were unnervingly quiet, the usual hum of life replaced with a stillness that felt ominous. Jamal knew he needed to act fast. He had to get ahead of whatever was coming next. His first stop was the mayor's office. If anyone had the power to help him now, it was Mayor Harris, but Jamal had a sinking feeling that the mayor was as much a part of the problem as anyone else in town. He wasn't naive enough to think that the power structures in Millbrooke had shifted just because he'd found success. The mayor's office was located in the same old courthouse Jamal had avoided for years. The building's gray stone walls seemed to loom over him, oppressive and cold, as though they were meant to intimidate anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. Jamal entered the building and made his way through the long, empty halls, passing portraits of old mayors and judges who had upheld the town's policies of segregation and exclusion. It was a reminder of everything he had fought against, and everything he still had to fight. When Jamal reached the mayor's office, the door was open, but Mayor Harris wasn't sitting behind his desk. Instead, he was pacing nervously, speaking in low tones with someone Jamal didn't recognize. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit that looked just a little too expensive for the small town of Millbrooke. Jamal didn't knock. He simply walked in, his steps echoing in the silence. "Mayor Harris," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." The mayor froze, his expression shifting from one of nervousness to something much colder when he saw Jamal standing in the doorway. "Carter," the mayor said, his voice barely more than a grunt. "I thought I'd already made my position clear." Jamal stepped further into the room, his presence filling the space. "You made your position clear with your silence, and I'm done waiting for you to make a decision. The town is talking, and I need to know if you're behind this smear campaign against me." Mayor Harris hesitated for a moment, then nodded towards the man beside him. The man in the suit stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You've been causing a lot of trouble, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice smooth, with a layer of menace beneath it. "You've overstayed your welcome in Millbrooke." Jamal recognized him immediately. It was Ben McAllister, a wealthy landowner with deep ties to the town's politics, and to the mayor himself. McAllister's family had been one of the most powerful in Millbrooke for generations, their influence tied to the town's old ways of doing business. He was the kind of man who could make things disappear, who could influence the law with a word. "I'm not here for your games, McAllister," Jamal said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You've been pulling strings in the background, trying to make sure my project fails. You think this town will be better off without progress, without change?" McAllister chuckled, a low, guttural sound that grated on Jamal's nerves. "Progress. What you call progress, Carter, is an invasion. Millbrooke doesn't need your kind of change. It doesn't need outsiders coming in, pushing us around, telling us how to live. You may have your fancy degrees and your wealth, but around here, we still know who belongs and who doesn't. The words stung, but Jamal didn't flinch. He knew what McAllister was really saying, that his presence was a challenge to everything they held dear. The old guard was losing control, and they were desperate to hold on. "We're not going to let you ruin this town," McAllister continued, his tone turning darker. "There's more at play here than you realize. You've made too many enemies." Jamal stood his ground, his resolve hardening. "You can try to stop me, but I won't back down. Not now, not ever." As the words left his mouth, the door to the mayor's office swung open, and in walked Officer Daniels. His face was flushed, his eyes narrowed, as though he had been waiting for this confrontation to reach its peak. "You should have known, Carter," Daniels sneered, his voice full of venom. "We warned you, the law doesn't bend for people like you, and now, you're going to face the consequences." Before Jamal could respond, two uniformed officers appeared behind him, their hands resting on their holsters. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to show fear. He wasn't about to let them intimidate him. "Are you arresting me?" Jamal asked, his voice steady. Daniels smirked. "We've got evidence enough to put you away for a long time. You'll be arrested for conspiracy, for your role in this scheme to destabilize the town." Jamal's mind raced, but he stood tall. The stakes had never been higher. The arrest wasn't just an attempt to stop his project. It was an attempt to destroy him. He was a symbol of progress, of change, and that scared the people in power. They had underestimated him, but they would soon learn that Jamal Carter was not a man who could be silenced. In the tense silence that followed, Jamal's eyes flicked toward the door. He saw Mitchell standing in the hallway, looking uncertain. The younger officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes shifting between Jamal and Daniels. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Was Mitchell going to speak out? Was he going to help? But before Mitchell could make a move, the moment passed. The officers advanced toward Jamal, their hands reaching for him. Jamal stood in the mayor's office, surrounded by the cold gaze of the town's power players. McAllister, with his smug, self-satisfied smile, seemed to bask in the tension. Mayor Harris, quiet as ever, lingered in the background, his neutrality more damning than any words he could say. And then, there was Officer Daniels, standing at the doorway, like a predator who had cornered his prey. The weight of it all pressed down on Jamal's shoulders. But there was a spark of something inside him, something that refused to let it end here. "Is this how you operate, Daniels?" Jamal's voice was calm, but it cut through the room like a knife. "You use your badge to intimidate, to silence anyone who doesn't fit your idea of who belongs?" Daniels' lips curled into a twisted smirk. "You still don't get it, do you, Carter? It's not about belonging, it's about power. And you've stepped on too many toes to think you can just waltz in here and change everything. Millbrooke belongs to people like us. People who know their place. People who keep things orderly." Jamal's pulse quickened. But he didn't let the anger overtake him. He had dealt with this kind of prejudice his entire life. But now, the stakes were higher. The fight was no longer just about himself. It was about the future of Millbrooke, and it was about showing the world that someone like him, someone from his background, from his community, wasn't just going to roll over. Not this time. "You're the one who's out of place, Daniels," Jamal said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "You've spent your life protecting a system that doesn't work. You protect the people who want to keep everyone else down, who want to shut out anyone who doesn't look like them. That's not power, that's cowardice." For a moment, Daniels seemed to waver. His eyes narrowed, and the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a deepening hostility. He stepped forward, his stance aggressive, his hands twitching at his sides. "You don't understand," Daniels growled. "You've never had to struggle, you've never had to fight for what you have. You think you can just waltz in here with your money, your degree, your success. But that's not enough. You don't belong here and you never will." Jamal's jaw clenched. Every word from Daniels felt like a slap, but it was also a reminder of the fight he was facing. It was a reminder that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, pushed aside, or dismissed. And Jamal was done being the silent one. I belong here more than you do, Jamal said, his voice low but full of conviction. I'm not going anywhere. With that, Daniels lunged forward, grabbing Jamal by the arm with a force that surprised him. Jamal was momentarily caught off guard, but the instinct to resist kicked in immediately. He twisted his arm free, taking a step back, eyes locked on Daniels as he prepared for whatever came next. This was it, the confrontation he had been building toward. He wasn't going to back down. You think you can just walk out of here, Carter? Daniels sneered, stepping forward again. We've got you. We've got the evidence. Your whole project, your whole career. It's all going down today. Jamal's mind raced. What evidence? What had they fabricated to accuse him? It didn't matter. It was all lies. They were trying to break him, trying to make him the villain in a town that had always been hostile to progress. But Jamal wasn't a victim. Not now. Not ever. Let me tell you something, Daniels, Jamal said, his voice sharp. You can keep trying to control the narrative. You can keep making people afraid of change. But there's a new narrative coming, and you're not going to stop it. Not with your lies, not with your threats, not with your badge. Daniel's face contorted with rage. You don't get it. This isn't just about you. It's about us, about what we've built here. You think you can just come in and tear it all down? You think you can change what we've spent decades building? Jamal's eyes burned with determination. What you've built isn't right. What you've built is a system that keeps people like me from ever being seen as equals, and I'm not going to let you keep that system standing, not if I can help it. The tension in the room was thick enough to suffocate. Every word Jamal spoke seemed to make the walls close in tighter, and yet, he stood tall. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everything he had worked for the people who had stood by him, and for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. I've got a choice here, Daniels, Jamal said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. I can fight for the truth, or I can let you and your corrupt little clique destroy everything I've built, but make no mistake, you're not going to win, not this time. For a long moment, there was only silence. Daniels stood motionless, his eyes boring into Jamal as if trying to figure out if the man before him was bluffing. But Jamal wasn't bluffing. This wasn't about bravado, it was about survival. It was about resilience. It was about showing Daniels and the others that they could not break him. Just as Daniels stepped forward again, intent on throwing his weight around, the door to the office swung open. Jamal turned to see Officer Mitchell standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his expression conflicted. What's going on here, Daniels? Mitchell asked, his voice shaking with uncertainty. This isn't right. You can't just arrest him without cause. You know that. Daniels froze, his hand still outstretched toward Jamal. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. Stay out of this, Mitchell, he growled. I can't, Mitchell said, his voice firmer now. I'm not going to stand by and let you railroad this man. He's done nothing wrong. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. Could it be? Was Mitchell going to finally speak out for a moment? Everything seemed to hang in the balance. The weight of the situation, the moral choice, was suffocating. But Mitchell's presence, his defiance, was a lifeline. Daniel's gaze shifted from Mitchell to Jamal, then back to Mitchell. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed as though everything would come to a head in one final clash. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jamal could feel his resolve solidifying. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. You're making a mistake, Mitchell, Daniel said, his voice low, menacing. You don't want to get involved in this. You don't know what's at stake. I know exactly what's at stake, Mitchell said, stepping fully into the room, his voice strong now. You've been using your position to cover up corruption. You've been targeting people who are trying to make this town better, and I'm not going to be part of that anymore. The words landed like a bombshell. Daniels took a step back, his face turning red with fury. But the damage was done. Mitchell had chosen his side. Jamal wasn't alone anymore. He had an ally, someone who had seen the truth and was willing to stand by him. The scales had tipped, but the room was far from safe. The final showdown was still ahead. Jamal knew he couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. Not until the truth was out. Until the corrupt system was exposed for everyone to see. Get out of here, both of you! Daniels spat, his eyes blazing with anger. You're making a big mistake. Jamal stood firm, unflinching. The only mistake here is thinking you could keep us down forever. As Mitchell and Jamal stood side by side, the tension in the room hung heavy. The stakes had never been higher. The fight for justice, for truth, was about to reach its breaking point. But there was still uncertainty. Still, the lingering question of what would happen next. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but the fire inside him burned hotter than ever. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Not now. The tension in the mayor's office was suffocating, every breath Jamal took feeling heavier than the last. The walls seemed to close in on him, as Officer Daniels squared off against him, his eyes burning with rage. McAllister stood by, a smug smile curling his lips as he silently watched the confrontation unfold. The mayor lingered in the background, his silence a stark reminder of the passive support he'd given to this entire scheme. But Jamal wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. You think you've won, Carter? Daniels sneered, his fingers twitching at his side. The air was thick with hostility, and Jamal could feel the weight of the moment, the crushing reality of everything he was fighting for. You're nothing but an outsider trying to push us all around. This town's been run a certain way for decades. You think you're going to change that just because you've got money power. It doesn't work like that. Jamal's heart beat in a steady rhythm, his pulse calm despite the storm raging around him. He had faced worse. He had overcome every obstacle that had been placed in his path. But this was bigger. It wasn't just about his company or his project. It was about the very fabric of this town, about the legacy of injustice and systemic corruption that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. You're right, Jamal said, his voice steady and unwavering. I'm an outsider. I don't belong in your world, Daniels. But that's because your world is broken, your system is corrupt, and I'm here to fix it, even if it means going up against people like you. Daniels' eyes flared with fury, his posture rigid as if he were ready to strike. You think you can just walk in here and tell me what's broken? You're nothing. You're just another black man trying to tear down what we've built. The venom in Daniels' voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just the project he hated. It was Jamal, his presence, his success. The fact that Jamal represented everything Daniels and people like him had spent their lives trying to suppress. The resentment was palpable, hanging in the air like smoke, choking the life out of the conversation. I've built more than you ever will, Daniels, Jamal said, his voice rising, his confidence growing with each word. And I'm not going to let you or anyone else tear that down. Not this time. You think you can intimidate me with your badge, with your threats. You can't. I've seen it all. I've been through worse, and I'm still standing. Daniels took a step toward him, the space between them growing smaller. Jamal didn't flinch, his eyes locked on Daniels as the officer's chest heaved with barely contained anger. You don't get it, do you? Daniels hissed. You've never had to struggle. You've never had to fight for what you've got. You think this is about your business, your money. It's not. This is about power, and you're too blind to see it. People like you don't get to change things. People like me are the ones who hold the power around here. Jamal's fists clenched, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Not yet. This wasn't about physical strength. This was about something far greater. About the strength of his mind, his resolve, and his unwavering belief that he had a right to be here, to take a stand against everything this town had forced upon him, and so many others like him. The only thing you've ever held, Daniels, is a badge, Jamal said, his voice quiet but full of purpose. And that badge doesn't make you better than me. It doesn't make you more deserving. You've spent your life upholding a system that only benefits people who look like you, who think like you. But the world is changing, and you're scared. Daniels's lips curled in a snarl. I'm not scared of you, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. You think I'm scared of some arrogant tech CEO who thinks he can save the world. You don't belong here, Carter. You never will. And if I have to drag you out of here kicking and screaming, so be it. Jamal's gaze didn't waver. He stood his ground, every inch of him exuding the quiet power of a man who had been through hell and come out stronger. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been oppressed, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every dream that had been crushed under the weight of prejudice and fear. "You don't scare me either, Daniels," Jamal said, his voice low and steady. "You want to keep upholding the system that's failed so many, fine, but you're not going to break me. You're not going to stop me." For a moment, the room was deathly silent, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Then, just as Jamal prepared to turn away, Daniels lunged forward, his hand gripping Jamal's arm with a strength that made the muscles in Jamal's body tense. The officer's face was inches from his breath hot and rancid. "You're going to regret this, Carter," Daniels hissed, his fingers digging into Jamal's skin. "I'm done playing nice. You're finished." Jamal's mind raced. He knew what Daniels was trying to do. He was trying to provoke him, trying to get a reaction. But Jamal wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. He had been pushed too many times in his life. He had learned how to keep calm, how to control his emotions when it mattered most. This was one of those moments. With a sudden, fluid motion, Jamal wrenched his arm free, his eyes locking onto Daniels as he took a step back. "You're out of your depth, Daniels," Jamal said, his voice calm but powerful. "This isn't just about you and me. This is about all the people you've tried to silence, all the people who have been pushed to the margins, and I'm not going to let you win." Daniels staggered back, his face flushed with anger. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "You've got no idea what you're up against. The people who run this town, they don't care about you. They'll crush you just like they've crushed everyone else who's tried to change things." Jamal's jaw tightened. "They'll have to go through me first." And that was when the door to the mayor's office swung open. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see Officer Mitchell standing in the doorway, his face grim. The younger officer's eyes flicked to Daniels, then to Jamal, uncertainty in his gaze. "Enough, Daniels," Mitchell said, his voice firm, but with a touch of hesitation. "This isn't right. You've gone too far." Daniels' eyes narrowed, his fists clenching in frustration. "Stay out of this, Mitchell," he growled. "This doesn't concern you." But Mitchell didn't back down. He stepped fully into the room, his gaze unwavering as he locked eyes with Jamal. "Yes, it does. It's time to stop protecting a corrupt system. It's time to stand for what's right." The room fell into stunned silence. Jamal felt a surge of hope, but he knew better than to trust this moment. Just yet, Daniel's fury was still palpable, and Mitchell's words had only added fuel to the fire. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over?" Daniels spat. "You're not a part of this. You never will be." Mitchell shook his head, his voice steady. "I've seen enough, Daniels. I'm done turning a blind eye. You've manipulated this whole town, and I'm not going to stand by and let it happen anymore." Jamal's chest swelled with a mixture of relief and determination. The situation wasn't over. Far from it, but for the first time, he wasn't alone. Mitchell had taken a stand, and that was all Jamal needed to fuel his next move. But even as Mitchell spoke out, Jamal knew the real fight was still ahead. The corruption, the fear, the anger, they hadn't dissipated. The system that had held Millbrooke in its grip for so long wasn't going to let go easily. "Is this the moment you choose the right side?" Jamal asked, his eyes never leaving Daniels. "Is this where you finally stand for something bigger than yourself?" Mitchell didn't respond immediately, but his eyes flickered to Daniels, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of his decision. Then, he turned to Jamal, nodding once. It was all he needed to do. It was enough. Daniels took a deep breath, his fists still clenched. "This isn't over, Carter," he said, his voice low and filled with venom. "You can't fight this system." Jamal's resolve only grew stronger. "Watch me." And with that, the final clash between the old order and the new began. But the outcome, the resolution of this battle, was still uncertain. Jamal knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The mayor's office was thick with silence, the kind of silence that followed a storm, a brief pause before the inevitable fallout. Jamal stood tall, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He had fought hard to get to this point, but the battle was far from over. Officer Daniels, still seething with fury, glared at Jamal, as if trying to burn him with his eyes. But Jamal was resolute. He had done what he needed to do. He had confronted the system, and now it was time for that system to pay the price. Officer Mitchell, standing at Jamal's side, didn't flinch. He had made his choice. The lines had been drawn, and he had chosen justice over loyalty to a corrupt system. The younger officer's stance was firm, his eyes locked on Daniel's, unwavering despite the storm brewing in the room. Jamal could feel the weight of his ally's presence. It was a silent acknowledgement of the truth they had both chosen to stand for. Daniel shifted uneasily, clearly sensing his control over the situation slipping away. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "You think you can just expose everything and walk away? People like me always win in the end." Jamal's lips curled into a half-smile. He had heard this before, from men like Daniel's, who thought power was theirs by birthright, who assumed that the weight of their badge or wealth would protect them from accountability. But Jamal wasn't backing down. The truth was now out in the open, and no amount of bluster could change that. "No," Jamal said, his voice calm but resolute. "This is over. The truth has been exposed. Your corruption, your intimidation, it ends here." The mayor remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold without intervening. Jamal could feel his gaze on him, but he didn't let it distract him. The man was a puppet of people, like Daniels and McAllister, a tool of the system that had oppressed this town for far too long. But Jamal knew the truth would eventually catch up to them all. Daniels looked toward the mayor, his face hardening. "You can't let this happen," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "You can't let him walk all over us." The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but before he could speak, Jamal interrupted him. "It's already happened," he said firmly. "Your system is broken. You've used it to keep people like me down for too long. It's time for change, time for people to have a voice, and I'm not going anywhere." The truth hung in the air, and for the first time, Jamal saw the slightest flicker of doubt in the mayor's eyes. The old guard was crumbling, and they knew it. The power that had been so firmly entrenched in Millbrooke for generations was beginning to slip through their fingers. The system wasn't as secure as they had believed. Suddenly, the door to the office burst open, and a new figure entered the room. It was Tasha, the journalist who had been following the story from the beginning. She had been working quietly behind the scenes, gathering evidence, talking to sources who feared retribution. And now she was here. A final piece in the puzzle that would bring the truth to light. She wasn't alone. Behind her were several members of the press, reporters from local and national outlets, cameras rolling, notebooks ready. "Jamal," Tasha said, her voice tinged with relief. "We've got the evidence we need, the documents, the recordings, everything you need to bring them down." The air in the room shifted. The moment Daniels had feared had arrived. The truth was out, and with it came the weight of accountability. Daniels' eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape route, but there was none. His corruption had been exposed, and there was no way out. The people who had once supported him, who had feared him, were now witnesses to his downfall. "You think you can just turn the tables like this?" Daniel spat, his voice shaking with anger. "You think people will believe you? You think anyone will care?" Jamal stepped forward, his voice unwavering. "Yes, I do. I think people are finally ready for change, and you're going to pay for what you've done. The town's going to change, and it starts now." Daniels looked like he was about to explode, but before he could lash out again, he was intercepted by several officers who had arrived with Mitchell's backup. They moved swiftly, expertly, ensuring Daniels couldn't resist. It was over. Daniels was no longer in control. As the officers led Daniels away in handcuffs, Jamal felt a surge of something. Victory, relief, exhaustion. The battle was over, but the fight for change was just beginning. He turned to Mitchell, who gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you," Jamal said, his voice sincere. Mitchell didn't respond at first, instead looking around the room at the chaos that was beginning to unfold. But then, he met Jamal's eyes and said simply, "You don't have to thank me. This is what's right." Jamal smiled, though there was still a heaviness in his chest. This victory was just a first step. The town's problems ran deep, and while Daniels had been exposed, the system that had allowed him to thrive was still there, waiting to be dismantled. Tasha stepped forward, her camera crew close behind her. "This is going to be big, Jamal. You've just changed the whole game. The truth is out, and people are going to listen. This town won't be the same after today." Jamal nodded, though he knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, and the challenges would continue to mount. The town would have to confront its biases, its corruption, and its fear of change. But Jamal wasn't going anywhere. He wasn't just fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting for Millbrooke, for every person who had been silenced, for every person who had been told they didn't belong. As the press began to gather around him, asking questions and snapping photos, Jamal felt a sense of calm wash over him. This moment, this victory, was a testament to everything he had fought for. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The next few months were filled with challenges, both expected and unexpected. Jamal's project moved forward, but the resistance wasn't over. There were people who would continue to fight to maintain the status quo. But now, Jamal had the support of a community that had seen the truth. There were still obstacles to overcome, still battles to fight, but there was a spark of change in Millbrooke that hadn't been there before. The mayor, though reluctant at first, began to shift his stance. With the media exposure, he was forced to address the systemic corruption that had permeated his administration. Slowly, change began to take root. New voices, voices that had been suppressed for far too long, were finally being heard. Jamal had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol of what was possible when someone stood firm, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He had made his mark, and though the future was uncertain, he knew that this was just the beginning. His work was far from done. As Jamal walked through the streets of Millbrooke, he saw the town in a new light. There was still work to be done, but there was a sense of hope that hadn't existed before. People were starting to talk, to question, to push back against the systems that had held them down for generations, and for the first time, Jamal felt like he wasn't fighting alone. There was still much to be done. The future was uncertain, but Jamal knew that change was possible because he had seen it happen, and he would keep fighting, no matter what it took.